Good morning and welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP. My name is Tim Hofmann, editor at the magazine Internationale Politik, published by the DGAP. In today's morning briefing, we turn to the Middle East and the implications of the US-brokered Gaza peace plan. The document was officially signed on Monday in Egypt, following the release of all living Israeli hostages held by Hamas. Since the ceasefire took effect last Friday, hundreds of thousands of displaced Gaza residents have begun returning to their destroyed homes. Clearly, this marks a new chapter, one that many hope could pave the way toward lasting peace. Yet, despite Donald Trump's declarations that, quote-unquote, the war is over, and his optimism about the implementation of the plan's next phases, the situation remains fragile, with several critical issues unresolved. Today, we want to discuss the promises and the pitfalls of Trump's plan, its impact on regional security, and also what it reveals about the role of the United States in global diplomacy and conflict mediation. With us this morning is Mairav Zonszein, senior analyst on Israel-Palestine at the International Crisis Group, and also a regular contributor to the New York Times. Good morning, Mairav. We are also joined by Bente Scheller, head of the Middle East and Northern Africa division at the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin. From 2012 to 2019, she led the foundation's Middle East regional office in Beirut, Lebanon. Next, we are joined by Murciano, CEO of the Israel-based think tank Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. Previously, he served as an expert on Israel's foreign policy and national security at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, the SWP. Finally, Julian Müller-Kaler joins us this morning. He is the director of the Strategic Foresight Hub at the Stimson Center and an associate fellow here at DGAP. Thank you all for taking the time. And before we begin, just a quick reminder that today's event is being recorded and will be uploaded afterward. As always, we'll begin with 5 minutes of intro remarks from each of our speakers. And following that, we'll open the floor for the discussion and your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please give me a short signal, ideally by raising your hand. And with that, let's dive in. Mairav, let's start with your assessment of Trump's 20-point plan. From your perspective, what are the key promises and what uncertainties remain regarding its provisions and also the timeline?
Good morning. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, DGAP, for having me. And I'm happy to be here with colleagues, some of whom I've met and some of whom I hope to meet soon. So, first, I just want to say, as somebody who's been living in Israel throughout this war, how much of a relief it is that we have a ceasefire, however fragile and problematic it is. It's hard to convey just how important it was to bring a stop, at least to this phase of what was happening, which was a very, very violent, long, catastrophic phase in the Israel-Palestine crisis. And the relief of the return of the hostages is really just unbelievable. I don't think that I actually believed that we would reach this moment. And so I want to give that space. Also on the Palestinian side, the fact that there aren't bombings every hour is huge. So that's important to keep in mind as I start to go into all the problems and fault lines and issues. We all know that this 20-point plan is extremely obscure and ambiguous. In some ways, that's also what allowed it to go forward. But I think that the spectacle that we watched both in the Knesset with Trump speaking there and then in Sharm el-Sheikh, bringing so many world leaders together, I believe something like 30 from the Arab world, from Europe, does give, some serious significance and weight to this. It's on the one hand, Trump's ridiculous theater and high rhetoric. This is not a peace plan. And so we all know that, but at the same time, I think he showed that he is serious about getting world leaders together. Now, obviously, Israel and Hamas were not at the signing of this thing. So on the one hand, that's a huge pitfall. And on the other hand, it kind of says, hey, the world is now stepping in. It's not just about, what's happening between Israel and Hamas. It's a bigger issue. So I think that's also important to keep in mind. Because I want to be brief, and we'll talk more later, I think the main thing that I want to say here is two things. One, that we know how Israel functions in ceasefires. Often it is the superpower in the region, it calls the shots. The ceasefire is already 48 hours in, very fragile. Israel is already trying to use the pretext of the deceased hostages not being returned in full as a reason to not allow aid in. We have had shootings of Palestinians who've crossed this yellow line that, nobody who's on the ground can actually see the yellow line. So these things, I think, are unfortunately a natural part of an initial ceasefire. But it's very, very important that we realize that Israel is still in 50% of Gazan territory, pretty much, and that was part of Netanyahu's victory narrative, that he got the hostages while remaining inside Gaza. And one of the biggest dangers is that this is where we will stay for a very, very long time. We know how Israel has remained in Lebanon and in Syria as well. And so in Gaza, it's more than certain that this will be a very, very long time unless, serious action is taken on the Trump plan to move in a different force. So that's one major pitfall. And the other is just I want to speak to the Israeli perspective that I think, the fear that now that the hostage is out and that Israel can go in and really do even more destruction in Gaza is a huge fear, and all of it kind of seems to wait on how much Trump is going to remain invested, and that's very scary. At the same time, I really do think that, because of what I was saying in the initial comments, that we're in a different phase, and that the war that we have seen until now is over. But the big question is what form it's going to take. And I think on that, Netanyahu has two directions he could take it in. I think he's going to try to stabilize his coalition now. He is already basically in a campaign in an election year. And I think, going back to what we saw is not an option, not just because of Trump and the Arab world, but also because Israelis really don't want that. So we're not going to see, I think, a return in the way that maybe some of his far right would like to see. The question is how he's going to spin it, because he still needs them for a coalition. He's probably still going to want to use that on some level to leverage his base. On the other hand, he might go in the direction of normalization, the Trump, peace rhetoric, try to see if he can get another victory and use that as a re-election campaign. So I think a lot of it depends on how Netanyahu is going to play his, political narrative going into an election year. And so it's not going to, I think, go back to what it was, but we're going to have to see where he's going to try to take it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. We will definitely come back to the election and also to the regional implications later on. But first, Bente, turning to you. How has the deal been received on the Palestinian side, and both among the society and also within political factions? We have seen in the last days that Hamas started to reassert a degree of control in Gaza. And so what does this mean for the prospects of the peace plan moving forward?
Well, I think I want to echo what Mairav just said about the relief that comes along with this plan. Not because the plan is so good and the long-term vision is already visible, but because the situation was dramatic in a way that anything that brings a moment to breathe and the hope for an improved humanitarian situation is really relevant. And therefore, I think we saw great joy already among Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and we had also the tacit approval of basically all Palestinian factions that spoke about it. I mean, Hamas said that it is in the deal. Despite that, of course, later on they said they are not giving up their armed fight. Islamic Jihad went along with this approval, and I think we, of course, hear the more critical voices of PFLP or also of the Palestinian authorities saying, well, there are parts in this in which we see ourselves and other parts in which we can't really see how that offers a perspective. And I think that might be something that we will really have to deal with, because attention is going to be deflected from the situation. There is no access for journalists to the ground. I think we have not yet seen the size and scale of humanitarian operations that would be urgently needed. But there is very little focus on that. And I think we're still somehow having the limelight on Palestine and Israel. with attention vanishing, I see a risk that many of the really important, necessary, and urgent issues will get delayed. So I'm afraid that the situation in Gaza particularly, but also in the West Bank, will deteriorate further. In Gaza, I think it is particularly pressing as a humanitarian issue, but in the West Bank, we've seen a lot of violence, and we have seen displacement. All this remains absolutely untackled in the plan, and therefore I'm afraid that the situation there will also be deteriorating. And I hear many Palestinians being particularly critical of that because there are no time frames, neither for the withdrawal nor for how the humanitarian situation is to be progressed, but particularly for any long-term political perspective, nothing is really settled here. And there is also not a plan how it should proceed. If you remember, the beginning of the year there, I think the proposal that was on the table and that had started to be implemented was a phased plan from its initial conception. Here we had kind of a package that was supposed to work together, but then it was sliced in phases. So everybody's saying we're in phase one now, but how the time frame for future phases should be and how they should be negotiated between whom, all of that is unclear. Just one sentence, because I think for the situation on the ground and the sticky question of disarming of Hamas, this is, of course, very unusual to have a proposal that demands pretty much from one side that is needed in the conflict a resolution to dissolve itself and to give up what it is all about. I think we can all see where it comes from. But of course, it is unusual to have it, and to expect that this will work was already difficult. But then seeing that the US gives kind of green light to Hamas in security operations against armed groups in Gaza, that is, of course, not helping, because it sheds once again doubt about this core issue. Therefore, I think we will also have to face a situation in which the daily mood of the US policy will shape and determine how the process continues. I'll stop it at this point. I think we'll get into issues later.
Gail, I would like to bring you in now. Before we also talk about the US perspective, of course, and also about sort of the phases of the plan and what is missing there. I would like to ask you on the regional implications, what kind of implications this deal has for regional security.
Well, yes, thank you very much. And I'm trying not to repeat the important things that were said by my previous colleagues here, by my colleagues. I think, first of all, we have to really recognize the major shift in Trump's position here. Regardless of his commitment, and it's still questionable, the president that presented for the Israeli right the greatest hope of the so-called the Gaza Riviera plan, the relocation of Palestinians, reconstructing Gaza without Palestinians, even annexation. And I agree with Bente here that it's not just all eyes on Gaza. The West Bank will become a major arena, especially in the internal considerations of Netanyahu vis-a-vis his own coalition. When he actually agreed to entertain the thought of supporting annexation, we see a complete shift in Trump's plan. Again, the question is about commitment, but we also see the major gaps that were mentioned here between so-called phase one. I wouldn't call it the simple phase, but at least the agreed upon phase. There is a violation of that phase by Hamas by not providing the dead bodies, the bodies of the hostages. But the major gaps is really about the disarmament of Hamas, the idea of reconstruction, which is such a crucial necessity, even on the level of building life-sustaining systems in Gaza, and the basic question about Palestinian alternative. And this is the phase that obviously creates a collision course for Hamas on the one hand, for the Israeli government, for this Israeli coalition. Of course, when we speak about Netanyahu and his line about not replacing Hamastan with Fatahstan, the inability to work with the PA. But one of the most important things on the regional level is coming from Sharm, and I completely agree that the Sharm summit was mostly a spectacle, an attempt by Trump to present a joint front, a broad front, a successful attempt, but mostly symbolic. I don't think we actually expected those gaps between phase 1 and 2 of the plan to be filled over there. But there are two major messages, at least one of them is on the regional level. First of all, it's about Abu Mazen, the president that a month ago did not receive a visa to enter New York to the General Assembly is now being approached as the main contractor maybe of phase 2, and not just by Trump, but also by the different regional actors. One of the major successes, and some would say the pressure mechanism that allowed this agreement to move forward, is the fact that you've seen a joint regional front, no longer Qatar versus the Emirates versus the Saudis, as we've seen in the Cairo Declaration in February this year, but a somewhat of a joint front, at least on the basic idea of ending the war and the basic conditions. What we've seen in Sharm is interesting because we've seen Abu Mazen being recognized in many ways as the alternative. There's a question, of course, how it's going to play out and how it's going to influence not just the PA future role in Gaza, but also the West Bank. Major practical questions that are on the table right now. Building an E1, for example, right now, in settlement activity there, discussions of annexation and so on. So that's already a great challenge to this current Israeli coalition with the new line about Abu Mazen. I'll say on that level that we've seen all kinds of changes on the ground with somewhat of implicit or acceptance by the Israeli government of certain involvement of the PA. If you follow the situation in the Rafah crossing, this is a place where the EU and European countries are also involved in somewhat passing authorities to the PA in Rafah. So despite the formal line of the coalition, you see some changes. The other major trend, and with this I'll end, regarding the regional role, is this somewhat of a power balance between Qatar and Turkey on the one side, and what we used to call the moderates, the Saudi, Egyptian, Emirati approach. If you look at the level of representation at Sharm, we've seen the Emir of Qatar, we've seen Erdogan. On the level of the Saudis and the Emiratis, a much lower level of representation. Foreign minister, in the case of the Emiratis, even lower than that. And that might refer to some kind of, while we see a joint front right now for the plan, when we move forward in implementing the day after, some kind of a competition. We already see that it's not just Hamas taking over, we've seen bulldozers carrying the Qatari flag, clearing debris, basically, in the streets of Gaza. So we might see here an attempt or some kind of a discussion, mostly vis-a-vis Trump, regarding who's controlling the reconstruction, who's defining these lines. And this might be a discussion that would not just be limited to Gaza. We are on the verge. We have a demolished region right now, not just Gaza, but the cord connecting Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria is about reconstruction. And these actors that I just mentioned are involved in each and every one of those arenas. So there's a question here about who's, if you will, is shaping or is more influential on shaping the so-called regional Marshall Plan for the region. So this is something that might start in Gaza, but obviously with effects beyond these specific parameters. I stop here, of course, and continue with the Q&A.
Thank you, Gil. Definitely very influential for brokering this deal was Donald Trump. I think there is no doubt about that. Julian, turning to you now. How might this diplomatic success affect on the domestic level his presidency? Are there any signs that this might have an effect? And also more broadly, how this agreement could shape the role of the US in international politics in the future?
Well, thanks so much, Tim, for having me this morning. I was asked to speak a little bit more broadly about U.S. foreign policy, but let me just say, one sentence about the situation on the ground. It was interesting if I'd listened a little bit to Matt's remarks coming back from Sharm el-Sheikh. He compared also the situation to the 1990s, where you were even further along in a peace process, and it yet fell apart regardless. So I think that points to the importance of what comes next and the implementation. A lot of my colleagues have already spoken about that. basically alluding to the fact that now comes the hard part, and that the devil always lies so often in the details. However, it is no doubt that Mairav was already alluding to this, particularly the return of the hostages, a huge deal in Israeli society and politics, and that Trump was able to broker a deal that made that possible is no doubt a big diplomatic victory for him personally, and the U.S. foreign policy writ large. I think if you were to define U.S. foreign policy in the second Trump administration, there are sort of three core elements, I would say. First is that his unconventionality in conducting diplomacy and international relations is often a source of irritation, but it can also be sometimes a source of strength. The fact that Netanyahu was pressured by the Trump administration to go in certain directions, and there was no necessarily a situation in which Netanyahu had it any easier than the other parts of the parties that had to be negotiated with in terms of reaching this agreement, I think shows this kind of unconventional approach in which sort of everything is connected to everything. I mean, Trump uses the full spectrum of U.S. foreign policy tools, whether that's economic pressure, the deals that he makes with regards to tariffs and other instruments of economic coercion, as well as military supply and public pressure. I mean, Trump not too long ago posted the pictures of the protests in Israel against the Netanyahu government to increase the public pressure in that. And I think that unconventionality opens doors for negotiations that have previously not necessarily been part of the toolkit. I think it is also important to understand in a broader context that this current administration doesn't necessarily believe in upholding sort of the rules of the liberal international order, because his coalition that elected him into the White House is sort of the ones that are, sort of the loser of that liberal international order, so to say. Particularly with regards to other topics, not necessarily the Middle East. But what that means is that a more transactional foreign policy is actually a logical consequence. Right? You can see this particularly in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, where if you're not protecting Ukraine for your own sake, meaning that believe in the extended domino theory, of course, Ukraine has to be grateful for being protected by the Americans. So this approach, I think, always is in the background of U.S. foreign policy today, as well, of basically no higher moral conviction in the sense of this is the right thing to do or this is protecting the liberal international order, but a hugely transactional foreign policy where the benefit to the United States and often Trump personally has to be illustrated in order for him to be active. And then the last element of it is that there's no loyalty to previous deals. I think the Europeans are experiencing that in many ways, but so do other heads of state and countries that think that they have a deal until Trump changes his mind and the deal is no longer the previous one. And I think that flexibility combined with the transactionality as well as with the unconventionality is opening really new diplomatic routes that have previously been unexplored, and that sometimes do in fact leave the door open to negotiations that would previously have been unimaginable. And I think that is what in part made such a deal possible here as well. In terms of domestic implications, Tim, you've asked about that. Donald Trump loves the show. He loves the big pictures, and that's what he got both with his address in the Knesset a few days ago, as well as with the meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. It doesn't necessarily matter whether the lines or the details are still somewhat blurry, and whether what follows is actually an implementation of that deal. But for the time being, he can portray himself as the deal breaker that potentially might not have solved it yet, but that at least laid the path towards that. And the chance of Trump in USA in gatherings in Israel is for sure a marketing material for him to elevate his success on the international arena. And with the fact that all so many European leaders, and I'm sure we've all seen the press briefing where they all stand behind him, and he talks about pretty much everything, including the peace negotiations, is exactly the kind of pictures that he likes, and he uses them primarily for a domestic audience. Of course, now the question is what follows next, but for now, he's happily taking the victory tour and victory lap at home. Thanks.
Thank you, Julian. I already see that we have one question in the chat. So just to the audience, please feel free to already prepare questions. I will come to that in a minute. But before you said it, Julian, we don't know what's coming next. And I think, Mairav, you said it, the big question is, will Donald Trump stay invested in that plan moving forward? So my question to basically all of you would be, what or who could keep him engaged in this plan to move forward?
I don't think anyone knows what, can keep Trump incentivized, except for maybe, I think this idea that he could get a Nobel Peace Prize, that has been something that people think is a major incentive for him to continue to be engaged. And I think the Trump-Netanyahu relationship is an interesting dynamic in which Trump has shown that he can get Netanyahu to sit and apologize to Qatar, but Netanyahu has also shown that he can kind of twist around and do what he thinks. And I think Ron Dermer has been very strategic in his relationship with Trump. So, I can't speak for how Trump is going to stay engaged in this, but I think one of the key elements is the Gulf countries, the Arab countries, and I think it's actually very interesting to see that Qatar and Turkey are having a foothold in Gaza, when what you hear from Israeli officials since the fall of Assad in Syria is, we don't want this Sunni extremist Islamist Qatari Turkish axis replacing the Shia one. And what you have now is much closer to home in Gaza. And so I wonder how Netanyahu is going to figure that out. Again, like, all of this really depends on how Netanyahu understands his own political survival. I think that's a big part of this. And how much Trump is going to see some kind of undermining of the phased negotiations and this plan, as it would seem from the outside that Netanyahu going against this plan, which he doesn't want to appear to do, but if he does that, it would make Trump look very, very stupid. I mean, that's the going understanding. But again, with these things, it's very hard to predict. I do want to say, though, that Trump is kind of we learned that he directly negotiated with Khalid al-Khaya in the work up to this plan. On the other hand, he's threatening Hamas again, I think, today or last night. And I do want to put just a spotlight on the fact that the deceased hostages, whether Hamas is using some of them as leverage or not, they made very, very clear to the mediators that it would be very difficult to find all of them at once. And we're talking about, rubble of, 80 to 90% of Gazan territory. I don't think it's absurd to think that it will take them some time, and that for this to be the reason for Israel to make the ceasefire so fragile, it's silly, because it's also not in Israel's own interest. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense. Israel wants to see this through. And if you have, the issue of Hamas decommissioning or disarming could be a serious one if Israel takes it in the right direction, and if the world understands that in order to do that, you need a stable ceasefire and you need a mechanism for decommissioning. As Bente was saying, though, it's hard to understand why Hamas would give up on its raison d'etre if Israel isn't even willing to show steps in the direction of a political horizon, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. So I also just wanted to reiterate that even though the Emiratis got a Trump statement saying there will be no more annexation in the West Bank, Israel's Knesset is supposed to vote on a preliminary vote next week to apply sovereignty in the West Bank. And we know, and I thank you for sharing this report that we put out for Crisis Group, that Israel is annexing the West Bank anyway, and that a formal declaration is merely a political decision. So I'll stop there, but I'll just say that, we cannot, Trump's understanding of the Israel-Palestine crisis more broadly is a big part of this. And for now, I think, he's only interested in seeing a cessation. And so I think it's really going to depend on the other actors here and less on Trump.
Would anyone like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, just if I may, I don't want to divert attention from the question itself, but I mean, I would be a little bit cautious from relating to Hamas as some kind of a status quo force that is committed to a Palestinian alternative or any way forward. And this is a continued idea. I mean, if we speak about implementing the two-state solution, and we definitely see an obstacle with this current Israeli government through its actions during the war and through its actions right now, and the very limited leeway to actually do anything about promoting phase two. When we speak about Hamas and the question of rearmament, we are speaking about basically, I think, preventing the next salvo, the next war. The situation where Hamas is still in control in Gaza, armed, is a situation that basically prepares the grounds for the next one, regardless of the identity of the Israeli government right now. And I'm not really sure that if we relate to the motivations of Hamas, other than survival, and the question whether or not they're using the bodies of Israeli hostages as some kind of a future card to be used cynically, or they can't find it, or the combination of those two is less relevant. But the question of rearmament is a question that's going to be presented to the international community, and I think it's going to be a test point in the future. Relating that to Trump and to the future commitment, as Mairav said, I completely agree. Trump has assumed a new idea or a new perception of a wide or broad basis of international support for his own fame and his own fortune, literally, by the way, in some cases on the regional level, but also because this is the new approach. Therefore, when it was about the agreement, instead of choosing between the mediators, he brought them all together: the Egyptian, the Qataris, in Turkey, and the same goes to Sharm, inviting everybody in, basically. So the ability to still be in the leading or in the driver's seat of a broad international effort, which is a change. Again, if you look at the first Trump administration versus this one, is somewhat of a main source of motivation. But I will add to that, and I don't claim that I can infiltrate the psyche of President Trump or even come close to that Trump seems to be connected to success stories. So if we are able, first of all, if we're able to keep the ceasefire on the most basic visible level, but we can also create or produce some kind of tangible achievements, one that could be easily broadcasted and affiliated with him and so on, as simplistic as it sounds, judging by his overarching Middle Eastern policy, that would enable him to be more committed or to continue with this discussion. I just have to say one major thing, and this is maybe about the European role in this entire discussion, beyond the appearance of Merz, as symbolic as it was, or Macron and others. We have to also come we also have to come to terms with the fact that the US has dismantled his network in the field, in the West Bank, in other places. The ability to implement is much more limited than before. On the diplomatic level, US aid is obviously out of the picture, and Europeans, apropos the discussion about Rafah and about EU-BAM and about those mechanisms, they still basically hold some frameworks, both the member states and the EU as the EU. So there is a role for Europe here. It's not just international community, but Trump is leading and we are just following. On the implementation level, there's something very interesting to be said about this regional European nexus. And we can, of course, elaborate maybe later about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we can do that just not now, because we got two questions in the chat on exactly that. So the role of the Europeans, maybe we can talk a bit more about that. What role is there left for Europe? Frank Pries asks. beside paying for reconstruction, although that is definitely an important role, I would say. But perhaps you can add to that.
Actually,
yes.
Well, if I may, I think there are certain things that we can do as Europe that are right now relevant, and I think a unified European position is quite good to support this plan. There was a universal recognition that this is what we have now, and that it should be supported. And the points that were already mentioned are relevant, like the monitoring, efforts to financially support humanitarian aid, reconstruction, etc. But I think we should not forget that this 20-point plan was good as a starting point, or as 20 starting points, because it is short and brief enough to really grasp what's in it and understand the overall line. But there are so many gaps that need to be filled. I mean, we will need further negotiations around pretty much every point that still has not been solved. And if we have seen one thing about the US policy of this administration, is that neither details nor really patience are characteristics that I prioritize here. I think here Europeans can come in with their experience and with their direct interest in having stability in their neighborhood, and I think they should make use of that. They should offer space, they should offer negotiation efforts and support mediation efforts. And I think to implement things, of course, US pressure will be needed, and they have anyway always played the biggest role in bringing about anything in the Middle East peace processes. But if you don't work out the details, what will you have to pressure for? And therefore, I think here the European Union should play a role, plus also their efforts to have their own relations both with Israel's neighboring states as well as with the Gulf region. For the latter, I think once again the US had the more direct connection, but with the neighboring states, I think for reasons that are outside the conflict, for like the neighborhood policy, etc., there are relations that could be beneficial in really also garnering support for issues that might not be a priority from the US point of view, but relevant to address the conflict and to mitigate the impact.
Can I just add real quickly to that?
Yes, of course.
So, I mean, we saw growing European pressure on Israel in the last few months. We saw the recognition by Britain, Canada, Australia, and France. We saw a French-Saudi initiative that culminated in a New York declaration, a very, very important document that hasn't gotten almost any attention, really, even though some of it has been integrated into the Trump plan. But, this pressure now will probably diffuse as a result of the ceasefire. And what's important to understand is that we got to this place in large part because Israel acted with impunity for decades and for the last 2 years. And so Europe has to play a role in that. And this also connects, again, back to the West Bank. You can't recognize the state of Palestine and not work to hold Israel to account for its settlement enterprise and its continued de facto annexation. It's just not, so of course, Europe should be playing a role in UBAM. Europe should be playing a role however it can in Gaza, but it can also play a role by continuing to keep up the pressure. And we saw van der Leyen and the European Commission change tack, and we've seen places like Italy and Germany with public protests. I mean, politicians in Europe are not going to be able to continue to ignore their publics, right? And this is part of why we've seen this change. So I think it's important to keep in mind that just because we have a ceasefire in Gaza does not mean that Europe should let up the pressure. And I think that it was not just the failed attack in Doha by Israel that led to this moment, but it was also European pressure, and that needs to continue.
We have a question from the audience.
May I just add one little thing about that?
Yes, please, very, very brief, and then
really
I would bring in another
20
question.
seconds?
Yes, sure.
Aside of all the activities on pressure points, and there's a question, by the way, if it was influential or not, completely right about the New York declaration being maybe the leeway for the second phase, but the most important thing that the Europeans can do right now. The EU is right now the largest sponsor of the Palestinian authority right now. And to keep it alive against attempts by this coalition, by especially Smotrich, to bring it to economic collapse is crucial. So if to be completely honest and a little bit, on realpolitik, Until this coalition in Israel changes, I think the main goal should be to preserve the feasibility of the two-state solution. And that's mostly through practical steps, including supporting the resilience of the PA, the economic and otherwise resilience of the PA, and maybe even using it in order to strengthen its state capacities as a whole. Just a small addition.
Kerstin Müller, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Great to have you all here. I pretty much agree with Jill that we should see the chances of the plan. We don't like that Trump did it. We don't like this whole theater in Sharm el-Sheikh. But I think the question now is, how can this plan be implemented, which actually doesn't differ very much from the UN New York Declaration, actually. I compared them both, and there are a lot of elements which are in this plan too. The transitional government, for example, the international troops, the reconstruction, humanitarian aid, and so forth, so forth. So I also want to talk about the European role. I think, of course, they should keep up pressure as others do it. I think they can play a role, in border control and so forth, humanitarian aid. But the question for me is, security is one of the most important things. If there will be a vacuum, then Hamas and other groups will jump in. So, and if you want the IDF to withdraw, we need to have a robust mandate from the United States, and we have to take this international stabilization force in place. And my question is, who will participate? And my question to you is, do you think that the Europeans also should participate if the conflict parties would agree? I think yes, a small part. The main part will be the regional actors and others. But I think it's very important to guarantee security, to put it in place for the Palestinian people, but also for the Israeli people, because I think the situation is so fragile. It's not clear if it's not going to turn back into war and even a worse situation.
Okay, thank you. I think that relates, or that alludes to the international stabilization force that is also mentioned in the plan. Who would like to answer that question? Who will deploy personnel to that force? How would such a force look in practice? I think that is sort of the question here.
I can just relate really quickly when we start the discussion among us. Kerstin, I think you touch really, you hit the nail on its head in a way, because in order for an international regional force to be deployed, in order for us to really speak about a Palestinian viable alternative, right, to Hamas control, Hamas has already forfeited its authority control, but even starting a DDR, a process of some kind of a limitation, obviously not the elimination of Hamas, it would never happen, but at least limiting its military capacity and so on, you need that force. But I don't really see their major participants, and to be completely honest, we are talking about mostly regional actors. The Emiratis, Mairav mentioned them, has offered before some level of involvement. The Egyptians, of course, would have to be part. They're already training a Palestinian policemen and so on. But the actual boots on the ground is a much more demanding, both internally, domestically, but internationally, much more demanding task. And I don't really see them enter this ungrateful endeavor unless it is part of phase 2. Unless there's some clear ideas about Israel accepting some kind of a broader framework, they would not enter on Israeli bayonets. So I'm not talking about Israel accepting or going back to the negotiation table. I'm talking about Israel declaring that they are willing to commit that at the end of this process or this interim process of international force being deployed, the baton would be passed to the Palestinian Authority, to a Palestinian viable, and that's the only, to the PA. Unless they are willing to do that, and they are far from agreeing to do that, I don't really see how this mechanism of deployment and building an alternative could actually happen. And that's where we are stuck between phase A and phase B.
Yes, very quickly, Bente, please. Then I would like to bring in Julian.
It's about the mandate, Kerstin. I completely see why you would say we need a robust UN mandate for that. But for me, it's difficult to see how that would happen because if we look north of Israel, we just have seen the end that is coming in 2026 for UNIFIL. And that is really such a major game changer there. And if we lose that mandate, which really has been established decades ago and is extremely important, I'm not sure whether there will be the chance to have a UN mandate for this troop. And I think that is a hindrance because how should it be organized and how could anybody participate in that without a UN mandate? But for me, really, it's a question whether you all see a possibility for a UN mandated mission in Gaza.
Julian, to you, Gil mentioned sort of the troops, the boots on the ground here. How is that discussed in the US? How is that discussed in the MAGA movement? So how is the further engagement of US in that conflict resolution? How does the MAGA movement sees that, and also the public, the broader public?
I think a troop deployment in the Middle East, yet again, from an American perspective, is something that is politically incredibly sensitive, particularly among the MAGA crowd and the isolationists that are gathered, particularly around Vance. When Donald Trump made the decision to launch this Operation Midnight Hammer in Iran, you could have already seen fractures within the MAGA coalition, that it was an incredibly risky gambit. I mean, more details are coming out now that Trump and the American military made sure that they even warned the Iranians, and it was sort of a lot of diplomatic talk around it because it was such a risky endeavor, particularly for his base that was in a way also a response to all the endless wars in the Middle East that previous administrations and previous Republican administrations have gotten the Americans engaged in. So I see that as a rather unlikely possibility, especially if it could mean that the Americans get dragged in more. And maybe I'll combine it with answering one of the other questions in the chat about sort of this transactionality, which I think is also relating to the first question that was asked about how to keep Trump engaged. Two things. I think it is very clear that Trump's diplomatic efforts do not necessarily distinguish friends from foes. I mean, you've seen this in his attempt, in his first administration, where he broke convention with visiting North Korea and getting together with Kim Jong-un. You see this in his the show that he gave Putin in Alaska, and I mean, just look at India. Modi has basically campaigned for him, and they're getting hammered by economic statecraft sanctions, etc. And that, of course, is really unconventional, but it leaves doors open for pressuring people that have usually been on the good side of the United States into agreements that they would have otherwise not necessarily taken. And I think Netanyahu has gotten a little bit of a taste of that. And I could see that particularly in a potential re-election campaign, that Donald Trump's basically doesn't hesitate to meddle also in domestic politics of other countries, and I could see him taking quite an active part in the Israeli campaign if the Netanyahu government or other parts of Israel politics go in directions that he doesn't necessarily like. And that, I think, is an opportunity to keep him engaged, because I, at the end of the day, do think that he actually does like peace. He is, his entire campaign was about that the world was a more peaceful place when he was president. He thinks it's bad for business, and he wants to have the credit of brokering peace. And now this is his peace deal, right? I mean, he made every effort to say that he was heavily involved. It was thanks to him and thanks to his diplomatic approaches. And that can be a way to keep him engaged if parties basically undermine his will of implementing that peace plan. And I think that so far, what we have seen also on the international stage, nobody has really dared to go against it yet, because Trump, as I said earlier, uses basically every toolkit of American foreign policy and can make it quite painful for those countries. The only ones that have done it is basically Russia and China. But they are the ones that basically have the strength to withhold American pressure. I don't necessarily think that Israel or other parts in the Middle East are in that powerful position, because they're much more dependent on the United States writ large. And I think that actually is an opportunity to keep him engaged and keep it on his radar, because he owns it now.
Thank you. And we have one more question from the audience, Peter Linke. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your interesting insights. What I'm interested in is Russia's perceptions. What do you make of Russia's reaction to the Gaza agreement, especially what has been said by Foreign Minister Lavrov? And what, in your opinion, could the Gaza agreement, what kind of implications could the Gaza agreement have for Russia's wider policy in the Middle East?
Yes, and it's still early. I mean, what I know about Lavrov's comment was mostly about the fact that they need to move forward into the Palestinian state level and move to the, and you can read it as a continuation of the long-standing line of Russia regarding the two-state solution, which is also almost automatic and somewhat cynical. But I think that there's something interesting here about Trump using this agreement to create a very strong international backing. With everyone, I mean, basically the only one left out in this framework is Iran, which you can find as somewhat the ally of Russia on the geopolitical level. So from Russia, from China, from the perspective of those who try to create an alternative, China, maybe it's an exaggeration to say, but Russia at least, to preserve at least their role in the Middle East, this presents an alternative, a very broad camp that could threaten their, the geopolitical position or this attempt. And Russia was not invited. I mean, if we think about the old version of the attempt to promote the two-state solution, really the old not just pre-7th of October, this is almost prehistoric, of the quartet, the almighty quartet, which Russia was a core part of. This, when we spoke about building a new international group committed to the two-state solution and adjusted to the new geopolitical reality, when Russia could not be part of such a coalition, then, you can define that as the new quartet or the new version of the quartet. So this is really, it's early to define it, but that's my feeling, my gut feeling.
Thank you, Gil.
And maybe just briefly on the Russia topic, I'm not a Middle East expert by any means, but what is interesting to see from the American perspective is that despite the ongoing tension over Ukraine, there have actually been attempts between the Americans and the Russians to talk also about efforts in the Middle East. Which by no means were insignificant. I think from an American perspective, parts of the Trump coalition would actually like to finally get over the Ukraine thing, because of all the other elements in which Russia and the United States need to coordinate on the world stage, and the Middle East being one of them. And with regards to what Jill just mentioned, Iran, I think also here, I mean, there was early in Trump's presidency, there was an outreach to Ayatollah. So I think this flexibility in that I've consistently mentioned during today's meeting is that you can see that once Iran shows willingness to potentially make a deal, out of the sudden they're good friends for the United States or for Trump, and he portrays in that way. So I think just the notion towards countries and towards leaders can change depending on their action and the incentive structure that Trump provides. And I think that the Russians and others have realized that, and I think that is just ought to be considered when talking about it. Thank you.
Definitely. I think we should definitely do another briefing on the geopolitical implications of this. In the last 5 minutes, I would quickly like to talk about, and I know this is almost impossible to do that in short, but I would like to talk about the upcoming Israel elections, and I would also like to bring in a question here that we have in the chat from Simon Gösketoro. He asked, how influential are Netanyahu's far-right ministers on the decision making of the prime minister? And he tends to believe that the influence could be a breaking point in the further implementation of the plan, and the breaking point here definitely independent Palestinian state. So with the election coming up, what future is there for Netanyahu, and what power dynamics you are expecting to play out in the coming coming month?
I can start on that. I mean, I just want to say two main things, I guess. One is that the Netanyahu and the far right obviously depend and play off of each other. Netanyahu has needed to form the coalition with them and lean on them for power, but that's also very convenient for him, right? Because he is leading the country. He's the one who also led policy pre-October 7th on Gaza and Hamas. And so I wouldn't put it all on the far right, in the sense that Netanyahu is also doing what he believes in. He also has been against a Palestinian state for his entire career, barring the 2009 Bar Ilan speech. And the far right has been doing amazing damage, both Ben Gvir on the police and Smotrich in the West Bank. This is what they want, this is what they're doing, and they're not going to give up power easily. So the threats to leave all the time, despite the fact that they are building a base and they're playing the long term, the idea that they're just going to leave the coalition, and now that they're in an election year, they have interests in playing into their own role. And what I'm saying is that it's not just about the far right, it's also about Israeli public opinion, where they are on a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu is a very, very resilient politician, and I think it's too early to tell what's going to be in Israeli elections. Netanyahu is not polling well. He's not able to necessarily form a coalition, but neither is anybody else. And the opposition in Israel is not willing to work with the Palestinian citizens, the Arab parties, and that's going to be a major fault line. So I think we're actually still very much currently in a political paralysis, the same paralysis we were in the last few election cycles. The big question is what is going to happen now in terms of the ceasefire and in terms of how Israeli political parties are going to form and position themselves. I'll stop here because we're short on time.
May I?
Yeah,
Sorry. In a nutshell of a nutshell, really. Something happened with the right wing, with this agreement, and with the hostages deal, even more so. Somewhat of a day of atonement for them. Because they were being basically left isolated in their own perception. The time of miracle that they describe after Trump presented his Rivera plan. And I would say less on the Gaza war, but much more about their opposition to the hostages deal, which is the major consensus in Israel, emotionally, politically. They've been left out as the negative side of the entire thing, on their own merits. And in many ways, Netanyahu's attempt to present this deal as a victory, also involves somewhat separating himself from them. So in this new narrative of I'm leading and I was able to finally reach what I always planned to be the decisive victory, and hiding the signs that doesn't really work with my plan, the Netanyahu narrative is not necessarily aligned with the one of the right wing. Having said that, what we experience a lot, and this is just the start of, in the last couple of days, is a discussion about the sovereignty of decision-making of Israelis. If you need to look at the visual, look at Trump coming out, arriving Israel, and the entire, the reporters and the media is jumping on Trump with Netanyahu walking behind him, shouting at Trump, is the war over? As Netanyahu is nothing but an extra in this discussion. And it's a growing understanding that Israel does not control its fate, that somewhat threatens Netanyahu. By the way, mostly not so much with the left or the center that are somewhat happy about these results, but mostly with his own audience, with his own core audience on that level. As Mairav mentioned, he's not pulling well, but the real question, and I agree completely, is the Israeli opposition, the ability to present an alternative. And up until now, including in regards to this agreement, if you watch Lapid, the head of the opposition, congratulate Trump, there's very little alternative that is presented. I'm saying that because we are working very closely with the opposition in Israel, trying to build the policy plan. It's an uphill battle right now. So to be able to, but I'll say just one last thing. When you pull the Israeli public, you find out again and again in the last year that the Israeli public or the supporters of the opposition from the center right all the way to the left are way more daring, and I would even say way more pragmatic than their own opposition when it comes to moving forward on issues such as a demilitarized Palestinian state. 55% of Israelis supported. So what you see right now slowly in the Israeli public is no longer classic left and right, but I will use Netanyahu's words, the super Spartans versus the rest. When he defined Israel, we should become a super Sparta. And that's an opportunity for the opposition. They have to seize it, of course.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to stop here. It's 9:30. I would like to thank all our panelists for their contributions to today's discussion. Thank you very much. We'll be back next week with the next morning briefing. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye. Have a good day.